What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to MGB Customs. So today's video is how to make a card wallet. This is a beginner video, beginner tutorial for those of you without a ton of experience in leathercraft, but with a little bit. We're not going to go deep into how to saddle stitch or how to do some of the basic techniques, but we'll try to dive in to a few of them. So to start any leathercraft project, you need a good pattern. Luckily, I've done that for you. The link is in the description down below. It's a free PDF download. I'm going to kind of explain a little bit of how my PDF works. So one of the first things you'll notice is I have a key up top that explains which each line and dotted line and dash means. And also something that's kind of unique, I have a middle piece that you're supposed to cut out. That just helps the pattern stick to the leather as you're cutting it, because usually you're just taping the outsides, and as you're cutting off the tape. So this just holds it in place a little bit better. So cut that piece out and then tape it to your pattern using packaging tape. That works best. So the darkest line you see is your initial cut line. You want to be as precise as you can, that way it makes it much easier when you do all your trimming. I like to leave trim margins with all my projects when I can, so that the edges of the leather are super flush when you want to finish them. If you're trying to cut it super precise without any trimming and then sticking the pieces together with glue, you just kind of end up dealing with some uneven edges and you have to do a ton of sanding. So the outside dark solid line is the initial cut line. And then the dash line is your trim line. And that's essentially just a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. That's a good rule of thumb. It could be a little bit smaller. I left them a little bit bigger for this project, just because the smaller your margins are, the more precise you have to be and the harder it is. And then the dashed line that looks like little holes, it's labeled stitching holes. That's for people that don't have pricking irons and just have maybe an awl. So essentially you can just keep your pattern taped to the leather after you've cut it or before, and just essentially stab through those holes through your leather so you have perfectly spaced stitching holes. These are set at 4.5 millimeters. It's a little bit big, but again, the more holes you have, the harder it is to stitch, just because it takes so much longer. Quick note about holes versus slits, like the kind you would get with a pricking iron. I don't like using holes. I know a lot of leather crafters do it, and there's nothing quote unquote wrong with using holes, but it does weaken the structural integrity just a little bit. Let me explain. So when you punch out a hole that you're going to stitch through, you're removing leather. When you have a slit, the sides of the leather essentially pinch the thread in place inside each slit or quote unquote hole. When you remove the leather with like a hole punch, thread can slide in and out much easier, just making it more likely that you might have a popped thread here or there. Again, this isn't a big deal, but it is something to note. Also, I just feel like a traditional saddle stitch looks much better with the diagonal slits of a pricking iron versus holes. All right, so let's get into it. So for this project, I'm using some shell cordovan. I had it, it's beautiful. I hate that I wasn't using it, so I decided to use it for this project. Obviously, you can use essentially any leather for this project, but there are good, better, and best leathers to use for card wallets. Ideally, you want a leather between 3 and 4 ounces. 3 and 4 ounces is ideal for wallets if you're not doing any skiving. It's thick enough so that it can be strong and hold up, and it's thin enough so that it's not too hard to work with or isn't too bulky in your pocket. I also prefer a firm temper leather. If you don't know what temper is, essentially it's just how stiff the leather is. A lot of online leather retailers will list a lot of their leathers by firmness or temper. My preferred tannery, or not tannery, but supplier is Rocky Mountain Leather. Super great, affordable, easy shipping, free shipping. They've been my main source of leather for a while now. That's where we get 99% of our leather for Open Sea Leather. Which reminds me, like always, this video is brought to you by Open Sea Leather. You can always get discount codes in my description for all of my videos to go use on the website. We've got some awesome things coming, including this new guy, the 50/50 Mini. Also was prototyping the Hobe Mini that will be coming out pretty soon as well. You may have noticed that this is an Italian shell cordovan. It's an amazing shell, a little bit more affordable. You get more color options than with Horween. Horween's harder to come by. It's amazing too, but to be completely honest, I've preferred to work with Italian shell cordovan just because of the finish and the consistency and the weight, which is also another word for thickness. If you didn't know that about leathercraft, a lot of times we talk about weight, but we're just talking about thickness. So for leather, for whatever reason, we talk about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ounce. Those are just measurements of thickness. I don't even know why they do it that way, but they do. So like I mentioned before, you want to cut out around the main cut line to begin with. Just give yourself a little bit of a margin. That way you can stick it to your leather without any issues. And you don't have to do precise cuts twice. I tend to block cut, which just means I don't like working with a huge piece of leather because it's just harder to manipulate and maneuver. So put your pattern down, stick it down, and then cut around it with a little bit of a margin. Try not to waste too much leather, but that just helps you instead of trying to rotate a giant hide all over your table. Okay, so you may have already noticed I'm not actually using packing tape for mine. I have these shipping labels that are like sticky paper, and I print on those and then just stick it directly to the leather. Just keep in mind it's very sticky and it may pull up the finish on your leather, so you have to test it out first. All right, so once you have your pieces block cut, you can go ahead, line up your ruler or square or whatever you have, and cut along that guide. I prefer a Japanese leather knife, but you'll also see here in a second that you can use a rotary cutter, you can use an X-Acto knife, you can use a mat knife. Anything will cut a straight edge. Everyone just has their preference. The Japanese leather knife is incredible because of the amount of leverage you can get and pressure right over your cutting area. If you think about a fulcrum, which is physics, which I don't know a whole lot about, but essentially when you're cutting with a regular mat knife, the fulcrum is really far away from where the cutting is happening. But with one of these chisel style Japanese knives, you're right over top of it, so you can apply a ton of pressure. You can get through super thick leather with this. I've cut like 15, 16 ounce leather to make shoes with a Japanese leather knife. So this part where we're cutting the curve, you can actually not do that if you want. You just have to take off about 12 millimeters from the top of this pocket. The curve might be a little intimidating to cut if you're not used to it. If you take your time, it should end up just fine. Make sure your blade is nice and sharp. But if you essentially just cut the straight line and then take 12 millimeters off the top, or about a half an inch, that'll give you enough clearance to get your card in and out and get your thumb on it. So right here you see me using a penny to cut a little radius. This is something that a ton of people do. You get coins in all different diameters, so you can cut all different sizes of radii. I looked it up today. You can say radii. It's a real word. It just creates a really great guide for you on something really small like that. It's really hard to manipulate a blade that precisely on a really small curve. Like I said before, here you see me using a rotary cutter. You can pick these up at any craft store or fabric shop. They're inexpensive. The blades are, easy to, interchange and take out. It's a great solution, and again, you get that same type of leverage you do with the Japanese leather knife. This shot is me showing another way to cut these curves on your radiuses. You can use it essentially just slowly rotating your piece and chopping down with your Japanese leather knife while having one tip of it anchored. It takes a little practice, but it works really well. And then you can just kind of sand to get that perfect curve. All right, so edge beveling takes a little practice. You have to maintain the right angle as you're cutting your leather. You just have to remember that at the very tip of that edge beveler is a blade, and that blade has a bevel, and that bevel needs to be at a certain angle to remove leather. So just practice on some scrap, try it over and over. Eventually you'll find the position or the angle that you need to be at to consistently cut. The goal is to cut each length in one piece. The best way to get the feel for this is just making sure you feel the friction or the resistance of the leather pressing against the blade. That's just letting you know that you're actually cutting something and not missing. It seems kind of obvious, but it does take some time and practice. If you're getting confused by seeing different sides of the leather, I actually made this wallet a combination of reverse and finished side out shell. But all the steps are the same. Right here I'm just sanding the curves just to make sure they're nice and round. You don't need to sand your edges necessarily if it's just a single layer of leather. You can, and you can always try and achieve better and better edges with more and more gloss, but this is kind of an unnecessary step to do across all edges if it's just one single layer of leather. So my favorite burnishing agent is this that you see here. It's Tokonole. I don't know if that's how you say it. Tokonole. I don't think it's called Tokonole, but who the hell knows. Anyway, I've tried a lot and it's my favorite. You just need a little bit on the edge, and then you can use some canvas or a wood slicker to get it nice and shiny. These little brushes that you see are great for water-based agents, whether it's glue or the burnishing stuff, simply because you can reuse them. They're really inexpensive and they do a good job of maintaining your place nice and clean and not getting mess everywhere. One thing I'll say about wood slickers, get a cheap one unless you just love the look of some of the nicer ones. It makes no difference whatsoever. There are some very pretty wood slickers out there, but the super cheap craft tool ones work just as well. So right here you see me measuring out just under 1/2 inch with my wing divider. The reason I'm doing this is I'm gonna mark my glue line. The reason I wanna mark my glue line is just to keep things nice and neat and make sure the glue goes right up to the stitch, but not over it. That way when you're sliding your cards in and out, you don't get any gunk on your card. So again, you're seeing me mark everywhere I'm going to rasp up and then apply glue. Right here, I'm just marking out where the card pocket is gonna go so that I know how far up to rasp. That way I'm not rasping on a part of the wall that you're gonna be able to see. You don't need to rasp up the flesh side of the leather. The flesh side is the inside, or the side that's not finished, simply because it's got enough texture to hold the glue and create a good bond. I really like this contact cement. A lot of people love the water-based glues. For me, they've never held quite as well. With a project like this, you can totally get away with water-based. The thing about Shell is it doesn't take water-based adhesive that well. I've just found that this holds my project together much better as I'm stitching. The shell is a little bit thicker, the grain is very, very dense, so it's harder to sew through. So you need that strong temporary hold of the glue to make sure everything stays together while you're working. Granted, there are some drawbacks. You have to make sure that you're getting off all of the glue from the edges, or else it's not going to burnish up quite right. It smells kind of bad, and it's not exactly non-toxic. So when you can, I prefer water-based, but this works amazing, and you can get it everywhere, like at your local Home Depot. So right here, I'm just taking a glue spreader and smoothing it out a bit. Again, with the contact cement, those little bubbles and pools, they won't just flatten out just because you're pressing the leather together. You want like a nice thin, even coat so that you have a really nice finish on your edges after you trim, sand, and burnish. Make sure to take your time when lining up your pieces. It's really annoying when you're just a tiny bit off with the finished product. Right here I'm just using the handle of my knife as kind of a burnisher, but more just to press down. You can use a roller. It just helps to smooth everything out underneath there so you have a nice clean finish. Then you'll always go back through and tap with your hammer. Again, you're just setting that bond a little bit better and getting out any bumps or ridges. This is probably one of the most satisfying parts of leathercraft, the trimming. It's just so satisfying to take off that uneven edge, square everything up. One thing to note, whenever you're doing leathercraft, whether you're using your pricking irons or a knife, just make sure it stays vertical. You have to make sure it's perfectly straight up and down, or else your edges will be cambered in. Same thing with your pricking irons. You'll have your pricking holes on the front in one spot, on the back they'll be shifted over a little bit, especially if you're using thicker leather. You have to make sure you're going straight down so that the holes match on both sides. So once your trimming is done, now you're ready to take your wing divider again and mark out the stitching holes. Again, I'm using about a 1/4 inch margin here. It's 6 millimeters, so it's a little bit more. It's not my favorite margin. I prefer something a little bit smaller, simply because it looks more elegant. But again, if you're just kind of getting started, you're better off working with a little bit bigger margins. Although I wouldn't go above 1/4 inch, because then the proportions just start to look wonky. I'm using a KS blade 4.5 millimeter 10 tooth diagonal pricking iron here. KS blade are a great iron. They're a huge value. They're not the most expensive. They're definitely not the cheapest, but they'll last a very long time. They're very precise, and they're readily available. Just a quick comment about stitches per inch, or SPI. It really doesn't matter. It matters in the final aesthetic of what you want. The more stitching you have and the smaller the gauge of thread you have, the more elegant it's going to look. Like Lesbian EDC, constantly amazed at the stuff that she puts out. She uses very small spacing with very thin thread, and it just produces something incredibly elegant. It's not really going to affect the life or the durability of the wallet. Obviously, if you go too big, it could, but 4.5 is very reasonable for so many projects. So it's good to get a pricking iron that is very versatile, especially if you're on a budget. I imagine you know how to thread a needle if you're watching this, but if you don't, simply put it in the eyelet and then go back through, pierce it, and then pull it all the way through and pull it tight, and it creates a little knot. Again, I'm not going to go really in depth on how to saddle stitch. I'm assuming the people watching this video know, but if you don't and you'd like a video on that, I'd love to make an intro video on how to saddle stitch. There are some really common mistakes with it that are really frustrating, because you'll get diagonals on one side and flat stitching on the other, or flat stitching on one side and diagonal on the other, or you'll get it so it's just really wonky when you think you're doing the exact same movement every single time. But there are some very specific steps and directions on where to take your needle, how to grab your needle, what end of the hole that you're putting it through. So if you want that video, just leave a comment, ask me to make it. I'll be happy to do it. I like to double loop my first stitch simply because I'm gonna back stitch at the end, and that way it matches just a little bit better. That way you don't have a single loop on one side of the wallet and a double on the other. Once you finish stitching, just give the thread a little bit of a trim, take your lighter to the back, and then melt it down. Essentially, that's gonna put a little mushroom cap on the end of the thread that's gonna prevent it from pulling through and popping a stitch. Right here, you see me taking out just the very, very, very tips of the corners, simply because it's really hard to maintain a tight point on your corners without any kind of bevel. So this way, I just take out about 45 degrees, and then I can go back and sand in a little bit of a bevel. There are rounded punches, but most of them have really big radii or diameters, whatever. So I don't use those for something like this that's supposed to maintain a very rectangular silhouette. And obviously these are the finishing steps. Bevel up your edges again, hammer things down just to make sure the thread is seated really nice. And then when it comes to sanding, there's a couple things. If you do what we did and we trimmed, you can start with about a 300 grit sandpaper. If you didn't trim and you need to remove quite a bit of leather to get everything down to the same level, really flush, you're gonna have to start at like 100 grit or 80 grit and really go at it for a while to make sure things are nice and even. But like I said, if you trimmed already, 300 to start is fine. Then I'll apply some Tokonol and I'll burnish. And then after that, if I really want gloss, I'll take like a 1500 grit and I'll sand what's already been dried Tokonol, and then I'll apply more Tokonol, and then I'll go back with wax canvas. Getting super glossy edges is kind of an art. It is more a test of patience than skill. You just need to go at it for a long time. It's like shining shoes. I was in the Navy for 10 years. Getting a really good boot shine, again, it's not skill, it just takes a really, really long time, and you just have to work at it. You just have to keep going and going and going. I really like using a wood block when I'm burnishing with wax canvas, simply because it's really stable and I can apply more pressure than if I were just holding it in my hand. All right, so there you have it. One card wallet. It's got a pocket on each side, a pocket in the middle for some cash. Like I put out on Instagram and other places, I'm giving this wallet away to anyone that subscribes and comments on this video. You don't need to comment anything specific. Every time I do one of these tutorials, if it's not a custom order for somebody, I'm gonna give that thing away. So stay tuned for that, future videos. I got so many different ideas coming. I'm gonna try and be really consistent, putting out a video a week. I know it's a little ambitious, especially when I'm super slow at editing and doing all of this and doing 1,000 takes for every single clip, but we're gonna get there. So appreciate your support. Thanks for being here. Let's grow this channel and make it something really cool.